straightforward as rook b1 followed by e5 or a5, f5. Here white hopes for long-term initiative, and also on the fact that black queen on a3, it's not well located, and it always takes time for this queen to return. So best move for white is to take on f6, because if it doesn't do so, for instance bishop d3, then after bishop e7 castle h6, that's also, as we know, a typical move, forcing bishop on g5 to decide where it goes, and after bishop h4, another typical shot, knight takes e4, not only solves black problems, but keeps them with the material advantage and excellent position. As a matter of fact, it happened in the World Championship match. Guess, Spassky-Fischer. So who else played it with black? And Fischer was very close of winning, but Spassky saved the game by miracle. That was a game 7. There were some other games, but again, it is not dangerous. So white has to stick with its main concept. Make sure that black king has no safe haven at the board. So that's why bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and then bishop e2. So how we assess the position? Unlike in this sharpest line with rook b1, we are dealing with sort of long-term consequences, because it's quite obvious that black king eventually will have to choose whether to stay in the center, and that's possible, but center is a center, or to castle, but castle long looks non-viable. Castle short also looks very dangerous, although black could do it providing the bishop stays on g7 and king eventually has a good location on h8. But doing so, we should also have to consider that white rook could appear on h3 through f1, f3, and then h3. And then it's just a matter of time before white queen appears on h file. So because black queen is far away, there will be no immediate solution for black problems. So how black could continue? So one of the ideas is just to play knight c6, castle, and some players ignore the idea of bishop h5, some players, but some of them consider h5 is a better option, just preventing it. You can also play h5 at move 11. And after king h1, bishop d7, we reach a position, and again, there are many games, but I will try to give few examples from strongest players and from the World Championship matches. Again, we have to travel back to 1972 to Reykjavik. Now game 11, Spassky-Fischer. That was not a very successful day for Bobby Fischer. This time he faced Spassky's preparation, or Soviet preparation, and after very unusual move, knight b1, he returned his queen on b4, which probably is not bad, but later it was proven that queen had to go back to the lion's mouth, queen b2, and white had nothing better than to play knight c3, repeating moves. But Fischer played queen b4, and after queen e3, he tried to take the initiative by playing very sharp, aggressive, but bad move d5, and after e takes d5, knight e7, c4, knight f5, queen d3, all his attempts to create some threats like h4 and eventually knight g3 collapsed, and Spassky won very quickly. So it did help him to regain the title, but it was quite a memorable victory, which spurred the popularity of knight b3, of this quiet line. In fact, queen b2 was discovered pretty soon, and that's why white never tried again knight b1, except I have to mention the game Karpov played in 1983. Karpov played this line with black. Probably he needed to win the game in the tournament in Hanover, and probably, most likely, wanted to make a draw with the world champion. He probably expected queen b2, but Karpov went on b4, and after queen e3, he played knight e7, and not only escaped in the opening, but eventually won a technical endgame. But again, from the theoretical point of view, this position after knight b1 had very little interest, and we should concentrate on a much more dangerous continuation that was introduced by Nigel Short in another World Championship match in London. And I was first to test this idea with black pieces. Nigel played knight d1, and I would say this move is much better, because white knight has number of options. One is, of course, e3, and more important, the pawn c-pawn now could actually move. And it's very much in line with the general concept that white is presenting in this position. It's all about position. So one pawn doesn't mean very much in the current environment. So it's about black's king, which is which stays on e8, and after h5, of course, it has very little choice. And white hopes to increase pressure in the center. So I played rook c8, Nigel played knight e3, probably rook f3 was another move to consider, because the idea of move knight d1, that after queen b4, queen e3, we discover that black queen still has no good square, and now a3 is a threat winning the queen. So that's why queen has to stay on a3, and after rook c8, rook f3 was a move to consider. After knight e3, queen b4 now, Nigel sacrificed the second pawn, but it was good enough only for making a draw, because after my queen was nearly trapped on a4, I played rook c7, knight b6, queen a3. The best for white was to repeat the moves. Nigel played rook e1, it was very optimistic, but after knight e7, knight c4, black sacrificed an exchange, and 2 pawns for an exchange, very strong position in the center, no danger for the queen. I created a very powerful counterplay and eventually won quite a nice game and a memorable game. But we have to pay credit when credit is due. The idea of knight d1 is one of the most dangerous positional plans that are being successfully employed by a number of very strong players. Whether black plays h5 or it doesn't play h5. So with the configuration with knight on c6 and bishop on d7, I recommend you to look at the idea of knight d1 as a very good way of keeping tension. So after experiencing this problem, I decided to come up with a different concept. And when I faced Nigel again in 1995 in Riga, he sacrificed the pawn, and I played h5, castle, and knight d7. So you can guess that one of the ideas of playing knight d7 is always to ensure that black queen could go back on b4, then b6, and then c7. So because b6 square now is controlled by the knight, so queen e3 idea will not work. And also it revived some of my old memories when in 1977 I played with white against very talented Soviet master Leonid Zayt in the qualification tournament for Junior World Championship. I faced this idea with h5 and knight bd7 with white, and I played knight b1. Knight b1 playing then c4, and it was a very complicated game. I won it, but it was not about the opening. So black had pretty good position. And I just recognized that maybe knight bd7 could be another way to confront white's opening plan. So Nigel played king h1 and I played h4, hoping for bishop g4, and then I just even want to play h3, sacrificing an exchange. Bishop h3, take on h3, gh3, d5, and suddenly we see another change, dramatic shift in the position. Black sacrificed an exchange, but the bishop comes on b7, and we could see that it's white king now is in trouble, and black king on e8 is in a very comfortable position. Then rook comes on c8, knight on c3 is hanging. So, very exciting. Of course, it all was just a dream. After h4, Nigel played h3. stopping the advance of that pawn. But now the pawn is not hanging, and maybe we have a square g3 for our rook. I play bishop e7, Nigel play rook a d1, and here I stop. It's a complicated position. I played here b6. The game was a draw, very exciting game. I made some analysis, published them in Chess Informator. It all eventually proved to be absolutely wrong, because in later games my analysis were refuted by those who were smart enough to use computers and to find out that even the greatest could make mistakes in such complicated positions. But I still believe that black position was very solid, and there are many options here. You don't have to be as precise and in the lines with rook b1 and f5. But you should be prepared. You should have good consideration of your plans, decide how you place your queen, whether you bring it back or you don't bring it back immediately. But it offers, this position offers great chances for both sides. That's probably it about knight b3. I still think that there are a number of positions that we may have overlooked in our short review. It just now struck me that talking about quiet line, I had to tell you, and just trust me, it was not a conspiracy, that after rook b1, queen a3, white actually could do something similar by taking on f6 with bishop, gf6, and playing bishop e2. Bishop e2. And you can see in this position looks pretty similar to the concept that we just discussed, but because knight is on d4, black could play knight c6, and now white takes on c6, exchange, and then castle. And again, there's nothing forced. There are no lines that I could give you as the final verdict. Black king is on the center, but black has two bishops, very solid pawn structure, and an extra pawn. So it's always possible to find improvements, and if you like to play active chess with pawn down, with sacrificing some material, it could be very rewarding to analyze this line with white. Just to mention that Fischer himself didn't like to play knight c6, and he played here bishop g7. But that's another story. And again, just look at the database. You'll find plenty of games, and even the strongest players cannot guarantee that we know everything about that line. Meanwhile, just let's not forget that I'm still playing chess, and I have some of my own analysis which I can't disclose prematurely. So what else should be considered as worthy of our attention? After knight b3, queen a3, bishop f6, gf6, bishop e2, knight c6, castle. We could look at move bishop d7, and I recommend you to look at the game, a very instructive game between Tal and Portish. So Tal played this with white. He immediately tried to attack black's position with f5, and then, I stop here. The game will be presented. In fact, it had a very good coverage in my great predecessors in the chapter of Lajos Portish, who not only successfully defended this position with black, but stopped white's attack and eventually won a game which was a decisive in the match tournament of three players, Portish, Petrosian, and Tal. So that was one of the rare defeats of Mikhail Tal in that line. But it also shows that black could consider sacrificing pawn on f6, bringing king on the queen side, and using positional advantages. Again, your king is exposed if you play black. But you have two bishops, you have very strong square on e5, and potentially you can use this knight weakness on c3. The knight, which had to be originally supported by the b2 pawn, but with this pawn gone, the knight is hanging in the air. So that's one of the obvious targets for black in this variation. I just recognize that we can go on and on and on, but it's time for coffee break and for you to digest the long story, the longest segment what we so far recorded.